Steps to the Shore by Seeking Tomorrow. Summary. Defeated once again, Namuri sunk back and let the princess drag him. The two made for an odd spectacle, Shuri limping ahead, one hand wrapped around the muscled leg of the feathered serpent god as he lay back, seemingly resigned to his fate. How Namuri might have made it back to the water after his final battle with Shuri. In any other scenario, it might have been romantic. A private beach, waves lazily dappling the shoreline, and the sun hanging low in the sky. Were it not for the black plumes of smoke curling off the flaming remains of a crashed ship, spatters of blood dotting the surrounding rocks, or the two figures very much not intertwined in a passionate embrace, it would have been the perfect setting for a proposal. Shuri was exhausted. After the adrenaline had worn off, pain began to settle in her muscles. Unused to such trauma, the hole in her side burned. She dreaded the eventual reveal of the wound. Like unwrapping a gift, she thought, she would most decidedly hate. At her feet, Namuri groaned, eyes squinting against the light. "Water," he gasped between breaths. His eyes rolled deliriously until his gaze once again settled on Shuri. At this, he furrowed his brow, as if trying to focus on the multiple Black Panthers in his line of sight. Grimacing, Shuri tossed the spear aside and looked down at the man laying at her feet. They were still a little ways away from the shoreline. Water lapped enticingly, white foam curling around the riptide as they pulled into shore. Their footsteps had already been smoothed over by the current, leaving behind a shiny expanse of sand, glass-like in texture. Shuri nudged Namuri with her foot. At least he seemed to have enough presence of mind to look up at her with a weak glare, though in his current state, he looked more like a bedraggled puppy, tangled curls hanging over dark eyes. Puppy? That wasn't right, thought Shuri. But she didn't know what the underwater equivalent of a puppy was. She should have asked Namuri the last time they were in the city, but how would she have worked that into a natural conversation? Cute was not a word she would so easily assign to someone who earlier threw her into a rock wall. But it fit all the same. Were it not for their dire circumstances, Shuri might have taken a bit longer to admire the smooth line of his neck or the clench of his stomach muscles as he breathed in deeply. Dragged. Shuri huffed. Her musings would have to wait. Favoring her good side, Shuri leaned down and grabbed a hold of Namor's leg. Conscientiously avoiding the stump of the wing she had yanked out earlier. She wanted to poke at the downing feathers left behind in its wake. Would they grow back? Namuri let out an ungraceful-sounding squawk. What? Before he could finish his sentence, Shuri hoisted his leg and began her slow trek toward the water. "Hey," he shouted, craning his head. He raised his arms in surprise, but did not fight back. "Shut up," said Shuri, but there was no real heat behind it. "Just stay still." Defeated once again, Namuri slunk back and let the princess drag him. The two made for an odd spectacle, Shuri limping ahead, one hand wrapped around the muscled leg of the feathered serpent god as he lay back, seemingly resigned to his fate. Bridal carry. It would be awkward, thought Shuri, but it would have to do. Bending down and wincing at the sudden flash of pain in her side, she guided Namuri up to a sitting position. The man watched her curiously. "Bend your knees," she said, gesturing with hands she'd forgotten were still outfitted with vibranium claws. Oops. She quickly retracted the claws and gave Namuri a nervous smile before she forgot she was still garbed in her Black Panther headpiece. Though Namuri did not strike her as someone who took orders well. The man obeyed, sitting up and bending his knees. Shuri then wrapped her arms around his shoulders. He started at her gentle touch, a far cry from the way she had been digging her claws into the meat of his upper back earlier. Namor was warm, Shuri noticed. Sure, she had just set him on fire, but the heat of his body was comforting. She wanted to curl up by his side, cat-like, and put this entire ordeal behind her. With one arm around his shoulders and her other hand under his thighs, Shuri began her slow ascent upwards. Even with the strength of the Black Panther, her legs wobbled slightly, a sign of her exhaustion and nothing at all to do with the man in her arms. If she had thought simply touching Namor was akin to lounging beside a fireplace, then holding him in her arms was like cradling an inferno. Are you always this warm? The words slipped out of her mouth, curiosity winning over her common sense. Or is it because I set you on fire earlier? Namor held himself stiffly, but whether this was because he felt awkward cradling her arms or because of Shuri's question, she could not say. He opened his mouth and closed it. Your strength is exquisite, he said. Choosing not to answer at all, his eyes roamed Shuri's face, but with her mask still on, his gaze darted back and forth between where he thought her eyes were and the pointed ears of her headpiece. Gaze firmly planted on the eye holes of her mask, he continued, I would have been content to die in battle against you. Well, I'm glad you didn't. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. For the good of the Alliance, she said hastily. Yes, of course, said Namor flatly. For the good of the Alliance, he echoed. He pursed his lips and stared off into the distance behind Shuri's head. To her charging, even injured and near death, Namor was still a smartass who couldn't help but get the last word in. I thought it was normally the princess who got carried like this. It was only Shuri's newly honed Black Panther reflexes that kept her from dropping the underwater God King into the surf. Side by side. Easy now. Shuri wrapped her arms around Namor's side, and even though her gloves kept her bare hand from touching his waist, she could still feel the way his muscles contracted as he moved. Quickly, she drew her hand into a fist, resting it in the small of his back. No, Namor's voice was a low rumble in Shuri's ear. Reaching around, he grasped her clenched fist and unwound her fingers. He patted the back of her hand as her now outstretched fingers spanned the width of his hips. Hold me tighter, like this. Shuri could feel Namor's own arm encircling her narrow hips. His fingers pressed into the muscle beneath. Taking a deep breath, she mimicked his hands, gripping his waist and paying absolutely no mind to the fact that from his proximity she could practically see every single one of his eyelashes, or that she could see the lines spreading from the corners of his eyes that hinted to some jovial nature that Shuri had seen a hint of when they'd first met. And he joked about the pressure of the ocean killing her. Namor grunted with each step they took. It was a slippery trek, made all the more difficult by smooth sand flowing around their feet with every step they took. Suddenly, Shuri felt the world tilt around her. Careful, Namor called out. He frantically readjusted his grip around Shuri's waist, yanking her up beside him. An important thing to know about the Black Panther suit is that it was meant for stealth. Unlike the bulky protection afforded by, say, M'Baku's oaken breastplate, the suit was supposed to be sleek and svelte. It was meant for infiltration, slipping in and out without being seen. An engineering marvel, Shuri had once called it. and a work of art for something so slick to be useful. It was this train of thought that permitted Shuri's overtaxed mind as Namor, in its desperation to keep her upright, held his hand against her sliding body, up past her hips, watched Shuri with detached fascination. Past her waist, past her stomach. In any other situation, Shuri might have found it in her to laugh at the way Namor's mouth formed a perfect O shape as his eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. Finally, Namor managed to get a grip on Shuri, dangling like a fish on a wire. Shuri didn't need to look to see where his hand had ended up. "My apologies, princess," said Namor softly. The tip of his ears were dusted pink. Despite his apology, he seemed in no hurry to pull away, his hand still as stone against her where his palm cupped the swell of her breast. It might have been her imagination, but Shuri swore that his hand was trembling against her, matching the errant pitter-patter of her heart. Namor had large hands, roughened from battle, and though he had earlier used those hands to impale her on the end of a spear, they now held her careful but firm. Shuri pulled herself up as Namor's grip loosened. He curled his fingers around the curve of her hip as they resumed their walk to the shore. Finally, they reached the water, sea foam rushing to greet them. Namor groaned, long and low, slowly sinking to his knees as the surf swelled around them. Shuri retracted the mask around her face, wanting to feel the sea spray on her face. The sun burned low in the sky. However, even the sun's warmth could not detract from the cold of the ocean. Namor looked over at her, eyes faintly widening at her exposed face. His gaze passed over her body and her shuddering shoulders, with their arms still intertwined. Namor brought Shuri closer. There they stood, motionless in the surf. The waves rose and fell around them, but Shuri felt nothing but the warmth of the body in front of her. Namor had to have healed by now, but still he held her. Shuri suddenly regretted removing her mask. Without its protection, she was quickly running out of places to cast her gaze. Anywhere, she thought, but his face, where Namor watched her, wide-eyed like a child. Elevated heart rate. "Shut up," she told the suit. "What was that?" "Nothing." End of story.